Well, I have to thank my previous lecturers because they presented a very, very important data, and that's a very wonderful, excellent background for my own presentation. I'm very primitive, coming with the papers. Sorry. You too. Israeli academia is conspicuously stratified, especially with regard to the hegemonic universities versus the marginalized colleges. The gaps are reflected in working conditions, salaries, professional social status, etc. The established dominance of hegemonic groups in Israeli society is reserved in the academia to Jewish Ashkenazi men and women, followed by Mizrahi men and women, while a few Arab men and fewer Arab women are at the bottom of the academic ladder. I suggest that colleges serve as a reservoir of academic positions for compensating mainly Ashkenazi women and a few Arab men and women for more advantaged groups. Nevertheless, although scholars in colleges contribute significantly to academic research, their economic and status rewards are inferior to those provided to their colleagues in the universities. Relating to female college scholars, I shall elaborate on their significant impact on academic social research, albeit their inferior academic status. The anthropological research in Israel will be used as a case study for delving into this issue. I contend that women anthropologists in colleges contribute significantly to anthropological and social research. Some of the studies seem to challenge research in the frameworks of the hegemonic academia. I shall elaborate on the far-reaching impact of these studies on social and anthropological research in Israel with regard to historical perspectives, to critical approaches, to research on them, gender topics, and more. Social issues like women's role and position in newcomers and immigrants groups, violence against women, women's situation in the labor market, the expansion of higher education in marginalized groups gained growing exposure thanks to research carried out by women in the academic periphery, no less than in the universities. The feminist research reveals that dominant culture ignores feminine experience and women's way of knowing, which integrates experience, emotion, and intuition. It criticizes the knowledge and research that are based on assumption, I quote, assumption of objectivity, rationality, and empiricism that reflect male thinking, in Bracha Alpert's words. Dorothy Smith argued that, I quote, women as a social group compared to men as a social group tend to choose research questions that do not distort the social human experience. Examining the beginnings of Israeli academia suggests that female anthropologist status, similar to that of women in other academic spheres, was negligible. This situation changed along the years, especially since the beginning of the current millennium. However, despite the marginal role of female anthropologists in the universities in the past, many female anthropologists managed to enter peripheral institutions at the margins of the hegemonic academia. Colleges and empirical projects became major absorption sites for them. I shall argue that those female anthropologists working outside the universities had in the past and have at present a significant role in the development of the anthropological research in Israel. Moreover, many of the studies carry a unique contribution to social research in Israel. Recent studies indicate that women's integration into the academia gradually grows, especially at the lower and the intermediate ranks of vocation and professions. The status at the top of the socio-professional ladder is also slowly improving. Similar to many academic fields, women's mobility in the departments of sociology and anthropology is slowly improving, including at the highest ranks. Dr. Orit Abuhav's doctoral thesis from 2004 clarifies that the beginnings of anthropology in Israel is closely connected to men. Its founders were men. Hertzog's committee, founded in 1933, that examined the possibility of introducing anthropology into university was comprised only of men. The ethnological committee that followed the Hertzog's report consisted only of men. The members of the Senate committee that discussed in 1939 the fields of Jewish ethnology were all men. Men carried out the early studies connected to the emergence of anthropology and ethnology in Israel. The Manchester Project in the mid-60s, led by Professor Emanuel Marx, the late Emanuel Marx, and funded by the Bernstein Foundation, was comprised mainly of men. Out of the 10 important anthropological studies that emerged from the project, only one was carried out by a woman, Elaine Baldwin, who wrote about a veteran Israeli moshav. Needless to say that most of the sociology and anthropology departments heads and the senior staff were men. Over the years, a consistent, although moderate, increase in women's rate among the senior staff in the universities took place. This process occurred also in the departments of sociology and anthropology. Albeit male dominance in Israeli anthropology along decades, albeit male dominance in Israeli anthropology along with decades, women anthropologists' impact on the anthropological research was prominent. Thus, Hilma Granqvist, a Finnish anthropologist, was a groundbreaking researcher at the beginning of anthropology in Palestine. Granqvist and the Palestinian, Granqvist and the Palestinian ethnographer Tawfiq Canaan are considered the founders of the anthropological study of Palestine, of Palestinian society. Granqvist's dissertation was on marriage conditions in the Palestinian village of Artas, near Bethlehem. As a Christian devotee, Granqvist researched the resemblance between the patterns of Palestinian villages and daily life in the times of the Bible. Perhaps it was not a coincidence that a woman and a Palestinian man, both from the academic periphery, represent the beginnings of anthropology in Eretz Israel, that their research was based on fieldwork, their subject of research was connected to social life in the village, and that Granqvist's work focused on women in the village. It seems that the settling of anthropology within the university establishment entailed for a long time the marginalization of Palestinian anthropologists and of women and the ignoring of social subjects such as the ones studied by them. Sorry. Okay. It's all because of my excitement.
It's a good excitement.
And nervousness. Okay. In the beginnings of the anthropologist department, women anthropologists were not part of the hegemonic academia. Their role in Israeli anthropology and the impact on it can be understood as emerging from the margins. Abu Hav's doctoral thesis suggests that many of the changes that took place within the establishment of the university were influenced by events in its surroundings. Thus, for instance, the Center for Anthropological Research, founded in 1956, enhanced the emergence of a leading anthropological affiliation group and the implementation of studies with regard to newcomers. Dorothy Wilner, the first head of the social research unit at the Jewish Agency, studied the bureaucratic treatment of the newcomers תודה רבה. Dorothy Wilner, the first head of the social research unit at the Jewish Agency, studied the bureaucratic treatment of the newcomers in Moshavim. Nomi Nevo, who was a sociologist, anthropologist at the Jewish Agency, studied women in the Moshavim. Moreover, empirical anthropology evolved through the influence of the research activity carried out by women in the research departments at the Jewish Agency and the Ministry of Health. Women like Phyllis Palgi contributed remarkably to the founding of empirical anthropology. This influence was introduced from outside the hegemonic academic establishment. Palgi was nominated in 1953 as the leading anthropologist at the mental health department in the Ministry of Health. Although close relationships developed between anthropology within the academia and the empirical anthropology, Palgi and other anthropologists did not become part of the hegemonic academia at the universities. Malka Shabtai, Palgi's student and empirical anthropologist herself, crowned Palgi as the mother of the Israeli anthropology and the first empirical anthropologist. Many women anthropologists found a home within various organizations that employ empirical anthropologists. Among them are, and I mentioned just a few because here we also have a few more, Anita Nudelman, a medical anthropologist who used to work at the Jewish Agency and at present is working at the Department for Youth Newcomers at the Ministry of Education. Malka Shabtai, who I mentioned before, she was involved in the sphere of Ethiopian immigrants absorption. She worked in with the military, the Ministry of Education, and so on. And Yaela Livnat Ra'anan works with Regional Council for the Recognized Villages and more and others. Shuli Hartman works for Bamakom organization, which strives to promote equality and social justice in the context of planning and development. אבל השתלתי 3 דקות. Sorry. Okay. So I have to go quickly ahead. The emergence of anthropological studies program in some colleges grew as a peripheral system outside the hegemonic academia establishment. In these programs, many female anthropologists and a few Arab anthropologists found a professional home. Thus, for instance, during the 7 years of its existence, the anthropological studies program at Beit Berl College, which I founded and headed, employed 10 female anthropologists. 3 out of the 4 male members were Arabs. According to Orit Abuav, the centers of empirical anthropology had significant impact on the development of anthropology in the university. Similarly, anthropological research carried out in colleges seemed to challenge anthropological research in the university. Several female scholars who work in academic colleges contributed significantly to the development of the anthropological research, especially to its historical perspectives, to gender studies, and to critical approaches. Orit Abuav, who was part of the faculty at Beit Berl College, represents a conspicuous example. In her doctoral thesis, she documented and analyzed the history of Israeli anthropology. Thus, a female anthropology from the outside the university's establishment has become the documenter of the history of mainstream anthropology. Many women anthropologists who offer innovative and critical analysis to fundamental social issues found a professional home in colleges. And I have a few examples, and I won't go into details, but anthropologists like Ofra Greenberg and Yael Katzir and Rachel Sharabi are only very few examples for very pioneering work, anthropological work in Israeli prison for women in relation to the Yemen women from a Yemenite origin. and others. So I would just like to mention my own work. And so as a researcher and teacher in 3 colleges for over 30 years, I tend to think that working in these frameworks enabled me to teach and to study major social and gender issues, to develop critical approach with regard to various questionable research approaches that prevailed for decades and still dominate the Israeli academic discourse. The fact that research in colleges was not a critical condition for working there, at least that was the case in the past, but from what I understood from Maya, it's still the case. They opened up for me, this situation opened up for me many opportunities to do research and write academic and op-ed articles free from irrelevant interventions. Thus, for instance, I published articles in which I analyzed critically policies and practices with regard to the Yemenite babies affair and with regard to practices of taking away children and placing them in welfare institutions. So I'll just go to my summary. So since the beginning of the 20th century, anthropology in Israel has gone a long way with regard to women's role in the academia and to acknowledging the value of gender studies and feminist methodologies. In the beginning of the anthropological discipline, women were marginalized and underrepresented. A few women anthropologists were employed in various state agencies and carried out mainly empirical studies. Their influence was conspicuous in various social contexts, though through the adoption of feminist approaches, by involvement in community life, and by focusing on marginalized groups. Since the 90s, women anthropologists are gradually integrated in universities and colleges in terms of both quantity and significant contribution. Subjects like women's status in groups of newcomers and of veteran groups, violence against women, the position of women in the margins of the labor market, the expanding higher education among women from the social periphery, gain growing exposure thanks to feminist research that takes place in the peripheral academia no less than in the hegemonic academia. Feminist scholars in colleges continuously raise silent subjects or subjects that tend to threaten prevailing agendas.